Hello, welcome back to my training, and it's day 14 officially. Unofficially, it's day 100, I would say. But regarding YouTube videos, it's day 14. And in this video, I'm going to do Endgames from the book Endgame Strategy from Chessbook. And I'm gonna begin with this example from the game Capablanca against Ragozin. And as you see, white is a pawn up here. And let's see what they say in the book. They talk about Capablanca's thought process, and it says here that white's plan consists of just trying to somehow stop the c-pawn from advancing and not making the weakness on b2. Because if you allow the c-pawn to move to c4, the b2 pawn is going to become quite weak. At the moment, black cannot push the c5 pawn, so that's not urgent. Also, the rook puts some pressure on c7, so that's still not the issue. But if the king goes closer, let's say to d6, I guess that then you can consider playing c5 and then starting to fix the b pawn. And here it says that white's plan should be something like centralizing the knight to d4, going with the king to e3, let's say, and also trying to put some pressure to gain some space on the king side by f4, g4, and similar moves. Also, what they say here, yeah, the whole game is gonna be won on the queen side because there's the extra pawn. And also, yeah, this thing about non-concrete things. No variations were mentioned, just some kind of a blueprint how to play endgame. And this is the one endgame that doesn't require really concrete calculation, because it's more about putting pieces on right squares. And first, white goes knight d4, improving the knight. Black goes here, and now b4, trying to fix the c-pawn and not allowing at any moment this c5, which would make black's life much easier. But this way, I'm sorry. White goes f4. Black tries to centralize, but now king f2, rook a7, and finally he tries to fix his weakness on a3 by rook c3. Now king d6, and now rook d3 by white. And now we have some repetition of moves. King e7. Oh no, not yet. King e3, rook a4. Rook c3, king d6. Now, white got what he wanted. He got knight on d4, king on e3, king is centralized, but he has to improve on that because he has extra pawn on the queen side, and the second part can be just to push the a pawn and to advance it as far as possible. So that's what white tries to advance. Rook d3, king e7 just to step away from some discoveries, and now rook c3, king d6. Now we have a repetition of moves, and here it says that it's very important in non-tactical endgames to not hurry. If you can push the pawn for 2 or 1 square, let's first push it for 1 square and then be careful about the position, because probably the situation is not very critical. Like in this case, the position is not very demanding, and it doesn't require anything concrete. So you can afford to be slow, like in this case. And also this repetition rule, not rule, but principle, is very good because usually weaker opponent just tries to break the repetition and gets into the worst position. I've been there. So now white goes to e2, tries to somehow reroute this knight, maybe even to c3 to kick this knight away, kick this rook away from a4. And now black plays g6, but I'm not a big fan because every pawn move against a knight can be punished very nicely. Now one check, king e6, and now king d4. After which black plays rook a6, rook e3 check, king d6, and now this, using small tactics. You cannot avoid them, so because if you take on a3, then there is this check, and you lose. So by knight c3, you begin to ask some questions as white. f5 by black, and now b5. Still, there's no way you can capture on a3 because of check on e4. So rook a8. Now king c4. Now you just bring the king to the queen side, and that's how you support the extra pawns. Bishop e6, king b4, and now I guess the only correct way to play this c5, because if you don't do anything here, rook d3 comes, and then just the a pawn starts marching. So c5 is a good choice, a bit desperate, but I think the only way to start playing for some counterplay, because that way white's king gets a bit naked. But after bc, you cannot capture it. You can just go back to g8, knight b5, king c6, and now rook d3. Now the g6 pawn becomes a target, and that's why g6 is a very good, very bad move in the hindsight. Now when you know that f5 weakens g6, it becomes apparent that it was not a good choice to play g6. And now black plays g5, but it's not easy. Now white takes, rook g6, now the g5 pawn is weak, rook f8, and now take on g5, f4. Now black tries maybe to just reduce the material by f3 and to hope for maybe capture one pawn and then sacrifice the bishop for the other, and to have knight and rook against rook, which is a draw. But now white plays a very nice move, knight d4, trying to stop f3, trying to stop the reduction of material. And now rook c8. Well, yeah, you can try. One can try rook c4 to capture the knight, but even then the bishop hangs, so it's very sad. Check, king b6, rook g6, king b7, knight b5, rook f8. Again, you want to go f3, but after this, king b8, now h pawn is running, and there's not even f3 because the bishop hangs on g8. And in this position, black resigned because he's 2 pawns down, and these 2 pawns are going to decide. I don't know which one is going to decide, but they're going to make a deal. And we saw here how slowly white played, and eventually he got what he what he planned. So let's get to the next position and also next chapter. This was like introduction into the book. Let's get to the next position. The next chapter is about centralization of the king, which is the main principle of every endgame in general. A very important thing. Without the king in the endgame, you cannot really count on any advantage, on the good result, let's say. And we have this position. Let me check if, yeah, everything is good. This is from the game Capablanca against Reshevsky. And here, optically speaking, it looks like black is doing poorly. I mean, black is worse for sure, but there is one thing that works in his favor, and well, let's first talk about what doesn't work for him. The weakness on d5 is not working for him for sure, and also the bishop is limited by his own pawns. And if white's king gets to d4, he's gonna put some pressure on d5 and eventually put black into some zugzwang, almost in a zugzwang. But the issue for white here is that he has this h pawn, which can be used as a hook later on, and that's why here black plays g5 immediately. What's the point of this? Well, the point of this is to either have a threat of creation of the passed pawn on the h-file, so that king is never so comfortable to just waltz into d4, and that way black has some counterplay on the king side. Or if he does something like some random king move, let's say, or just something like knight b4, let's say this, you can just take and go bishop c8, and again, white cannot really enter d4 with clear conscience, because the king, black's king, can target this weakness on h4. The h4 pawn is very weak, and he has to have this on mind every time he gets away from his h4 pawn. So things are not so simple, and white took here on g5. We had fg, and now knight b4. It says here that after f4, you can take it, ef, and now after d4, black is still worse, but he has some activity. Which makes sense. The bishop got out, and eventually, even when the king marches here, he might target g3. So that's my understanding of this remark. Okay, so after this, he went to b4. Now ab, you have to capture it because the pawn is just going to promote. ab, bishop b7, keeping an eye on this one. And now g4. And now it says here again, a black's only counterplay is to play h5 at some point. And yeah, there are two ways to do that, by doing some bishop e8, but I don't know when, because this pawn is just hanging. Maybe when the king goes to e6, then you can just jump around. Bishop c8, bishop d7, bishop e8, and then h5, but here black goes king g7, king e2, king g6, and now he's ready to push h5. King d3, h5, takes, and now white eventually gets the d pawn, but the king gets very active, and That's the point of this chapter. How the active king can compensate some material deficit. Let's see what happened next. White plays this because there's no way to stop it. If you go king e4, well, bishop d5 takes and king f3. Now the g-pawn is gonna run. So f4 has to be played. After which g4. Just putting all hopes, putting all eggs in one basket. This g-pawn should run. If you take on d5 and then go g4, well, then there's f5, right? Yeah, f5, king h3, f6, g3, f7, and in the end we have queen endgame, but we're very soon going to exchange queens. After this, king g7, or yeah, queen g8, whatever. You exchange queens and then push the e-pawn. So that's why black plays g4, and now white has to be a bit careful because the g-pawn can become a huge asset. I mean, it's already a huge asset, but also there are some ideas like sacrifice the knight for pawn and then having two pawns against the bishop, which in some cases is enough. Now white pushes the f-pawn, bishop c8. Now they mention here bishop c6 is bad because of knight... Oh no, wait. Knight c7. That makes sense because it stops bishop e8 and you can just promote without any problem, without having to give up the pawn for a bishop. So bishop c8 is played, king e5, bishop d7, and now e4. And here, this is a nice line. If you go knight c7, that's a mistake. Because now black takes on f5, takes and goes king f3. Now you gotta choose which pawn. Well, you don't have to choose, you just... if you take on b5, I can push for sure. This one takes, and now you have to just bail out with king g4, right? And then you take the knight and yeah, take the pawn. Why not? So e4 is played, bishop e8, and now the mistake, king d4. It says here that the winning move was f6. And if this, to just go knight f4. g3 and now king f5. Now you're okay with g2 because after you capture, the e-pawn starts marching and these two pawns are unstoppable, so it doesn't make sense to do that for black. So he might try something else, but even that doesn't work. Let's say bishop d7, like in the book, king g5, and now bishop e6. A very clever try, but... And now white can just take this bishop, which is very nice. And if g2, f7, g1 queen, and then king f6, and it's just lost for black, because there's no way of stopping this promotion. And I believe him. But white didn't play this, he played king d4. Now king f3, e5, g3, and now knight e3. And this is the moment where black could have drawn. He played king f4, trying to somehow maybe lure the knight to capture the f-pawn. But actually here, he could have gone bishop f7. And if e6, then bishop g8. And if e7, then bishop f7 here, and now king f4. And then you lure the knight. Plus, this is zugzwang, I think, because if you move the knight to g2, there's king f5, and you capture the f6 pawn, and it's just, well, it's even white who has to be a bit careful. If you move the king, well, I can even do this. Why not? And also after bishop f7, e6, bishop g8, after b4, you can go king f4, and again, these pawns are very loose. The knight is stuck to the g-pawn, and if you do e7, bishop f7, f6, you might just go bishop e8, right? Bishop e8, and how do you continue even? I don't know. If the knight moves, then you go king f5. Or do you go maybe king f3? No, you go king f3 actually. I think you go here. And then if this, then just g2 here and queen. And I don't think this is winning for white. Actually, maybe it's the other way around. No, I think even this is a draw because white's pawns are too dangerous and black would have to just make perpetual. But in the game, he played king f4, e6, and now g2. And he took in the end this f-pawn, but now the e-pawn remained, and after king g4, knight e3, king f4, king d4, and now this knight is going to just get to d5, the e-pawn is going to be pushed, and knight c7. Well, first e7, because you want to first push the pawn as far as possible, because if you do first knight d5, then after king f5 the pawn gets attacked, but if you do e7 first, then it's a different story. And yeah, he resigned. Black resigned here after king d4. Also, after this game, they mentioned the second way of playing, and it was, let me see at which moment, after g4. After this position, black played king g7, king g6, and then played h5. But here they mentioned that passive defense like king f7, king e2, king f6, king d3, king e5 works as well. Knight c2, bishop c6, knight d4, bishop e8, and then you push h5. Well, actually, if I remember, they never told that black made a mistake. It was just white who was winning, and it's a bit strange, but doesn't matter. This is about the principles. This, king b4, and now g4. Now the point of this is to get king e4 in and to target the e3 pawn. So king b5, king e4, king c5, king e3, and it's a very simple draw. Okay. Next position is this one. Black is an exchange up, but white has a couple of fellas on the king side, which might save the game in the end. And now black plays rook h8. Trying to get rook e8 and trying to challenge white's king. And also his idea is to push at some point a6, a5 and to make a passer, even at the cost of a pawn. Because if he gets to queen one of his pawns, it's gonna be worth it. Especially if it's a clean queen, not given for a knight or something like that. But here actually Alekhine mentioned that rook d7 was winning. And after... Okay, let's first check knight f6. In that case, rook d8, g5, and now a5. Now you're ready to sacrifice the rook for this g-pawn and then just promote this guy. After this, b3, and it's just winning. And if you go here, still a5 works. And then the b-pawn marches, and now king c5 to stop maybe knight c4. Knight c2, b3, knight a3, and now b2. g6, king gets closer, and the point of the king activity here is, of course, you can always get rook d1 in and promote, but the point was not to give up this pawn, just to promote it to a queen and not being able, white not being able to capture it with the knight. Oh wait, sorry. I messed up here. Knight a3, king b4, and now after this to go rook d1, and now the knight is just trapped, and the b-pawn is going to promote cleanly, quote unquote. That's how black was supposed to win, but things are not so simple in the game. Black played rook h8, and now knight e3. Rook e8, king d4, rook d8, and now king e4. A very interesting move, because now the king is cut off from the queen side, which might be very important for keeping the b-pawn on leash. But also if you go to c3, it has a different setback. And that setback is you don't have the support for the kingside pawns. But actually, it might be even better, because these pawns might just self-sustain with the knight. Maybe they don't need the support of the king. Maybe the knight is just enough for these pawns. So maybe their assessment in the book is a bit wrong, I would say. But let's go back to the game. They didn't show any variation on king c3, although I think it deserves some attention, because if you get to c3, you kind of stop a5 ideas once and for all. So you go to e4, and now black goes a5, ba, and now b4. And white tries with a6. It says here that g5 was losing because of b3, knight c4, king c5, knight b2, rook d2, knight d3, king c4, and finally the knight gets boxed out and the b-pawn can just march. Okay, so this is the best try, according to the book. And now king c5. And still, things are very tricky because here they mention a very natural pawn push is not good because of knight c4. And if king b5, knight b2. Now actually you don't have time for rook d2 because of a7. And now the rook has to spend some time to go back. And now the g-pawn can be, the kingside pawns can become really dangerous. And you don't really have time to evict this knight from b2. So black has to spend tempo on this move. But then the f pawn starts marching. f5 and... what's happening? If rook d2, then just this. And if this, then f6. And the pawns become very dangerous. And in the end, it finishes in a draw. Okay, so this was a good move, king c5. King c5, a7, and now b3. And now the knight goes back. Knight is chilling because the a-pawn allows him to do that. Now the rook has to go to a8. g5, rook a7, and now g6. The g-pawn is also a huge asset. Rook d7. Now this move. Rook d2, and now a very nice move. King f3. Disallowing capture because of g7, and now there's no rook g2 to save this. So the rook has to go to d8. King e4, king d6. And now king d4. Now the king just tries to pick up the b-pawn while black picks up these two. But if he manages to pick up the b-pawn, it's going to be a draw because a rook against the knight is a draw. So black tries somehow to cut the king, rook c8. And now g7. The g-pawn is just a sacrificial lamb. And by deflecting the rook, king gets to c3 or c4 and attacks the pawn. Now king e6, queen takes, king c4, and now rook g3. And here they mention if you defend like this, black is still gonna lose the pawn because after king c3, king f5, knight d3, rook b6, and now you just wait, knight b2, which is a bit paradoxical, I would say. Now, even with this extra pawn, with the exchange up, black cannot do much. White has this move. Or knight a4 even. Knight a4, rook b8, knight b2. And it says here that black doesn't have the opportunity to win. When the king gets to e1, there is knight a4, and on king c1, king d1, king b2. Aha, if you get to d1, let's just... If something like this happens, then knight a4, king d1, king b2. This. And if king d2, then knight c5, and then you capture on b3, and there's no way you can go king d3, king c4, because you cannot. So black chose to defend again from this side. Rook g3, knight a4, and now king f5. King b4, king f4, knight b2. King e4, knight a4, what is this? King d4, knight b2, rook f3, knight a4, rook e3. There's no progress. And now he tries to go from the other side, but after this, now king a3. And now if king e2, there's king b2. And if you try king d2 now, then knight c5, knight b3. I just captured this guy. So he goes from this side. It's a very nice technique. King d4, knight b2 now. Trying to stop king d3, because if he gets that, king d3, king c2, it's just game over. Rook h3, knight a4, and now finally he went here, but now he took on b3. And it's a draw. Okay, let's do one more position and that should be it. Let's see this one. This is supposed to be some exchange Spanish, I would say. Looks like that. And like always, in this structure, white has the majority on the king side, which might pay off in the pawn endgame, but so far it should be okay. But this was actually the critical moment in the position. And black played king c8. Which makes his position really, really tough, because the king gets cut off. And having in mind that white has extra pawn on this side and the king is cut off, that means that black has the one less piece in the attack. It says here that it's better to just go either bishop d6 and after this to go king e7 and to keep the king on this side, or to just play queen d4. Oops. To play queen d4 and I suppose after this to go king e8. And then bishop d6 or bishop c5, something like that, and try to maintain this, to restrain the extra pawn. But in the game he played king c8, and after this he also played g6, which is also not helping black at all. It's better to play bishop e7. And the thing about g6 is now it makes some holes in the position and the king might be able to get like something like this in some future, not immediately, but now first white goes e5, trying to get more space, bishop g7, and now f4. And a huge threat is knight e4 and knight g5 or knight f6. So black played f6, trying to get this bishop opened, takes, and now e4. h5, king g2, and now he takes on c3, bc3. And now you see the difference between the two kings. This king is cut off and it doesn't participate in the game. You cannot really uncut it with rook d8 because, like I told before, the pawn endgame is lost in this particular case, because there's an option of just creating a pass pawn on the king side, and that passed pawn is going to be used as a decoy to capture these pawns. So black is pretty much doomed. Plus, these pawns on the king side are quite vulnerable because the king is going to enter very soon. Black plays b5, but first e5, a5, king h3, and very quickly black's position collapses because after king h4, rook e8, king g5, now the g6 pawn is a huge target. After rook e6, there's king h6, and now the king gets via g7 and f7, and you cannot defend against e6. When the rook moves, you can even push this pawn and promote. So after this, black resigned. And yeah, you saw how the king activity is very crucial in some endgames. Not every, but most. And that's it. I'll see you tomorrow when I'll continue this book, and have a good day. Bye.